You ever come outside to find a giant orange sticker on your vehicle with the words "Move it or lose it" slapped across your window like some kind of eviction notice for your camper, and then look up to see a smug woman in a visor taking photos like she just uncovered a crime scene? That was my Monday. The camper was legally parked. My tags were up to date. But none of that mattered to Karen, the HOA president, who decided my camper was an eyesore that threatened the sacred aesthetic of her plastic lawn flamingos. She gave me exactly 3 days to move it or face towing, fines, and further action, whatever that meant. She didn't know she was picking a fight with someone who once bought a goat just to shut down a neighbor's illegal petting zoo. And if she thought I was going to roll over and obey because she waved a clipboard in my face, she had no idea who she was dealing with. So I did what any rational, thoroughly annoyed man would do. I bought the street. It all started on a breezy Monday morning. I had just finished brewing coffee inside my camper, parked along the curb outside my own home, when I heard what sounded like a camera shutter and high-pitched muttering. I peeked out the tiny window and, sure enough, there she was. Karen. Clad in her tennis gear at 8 a.m. sharp, one hand on her hip, the other snapping photos of my camper like it was a UFO crash site. I stepped out with my coffee and gave her a cheerful good morning. She responded like I had just spit in her HOA-approved birdbath. She waved her clipboard in my direction and declared that I was in violation of Section 14B subpoint 3, unauthorized oversized vehicles. I politely pointed out that the camper was registered, insured, not on any red line or fire lane, and was on a public street. She didn't care. She said she had already called in a complaint, and if it wasn't gone in 72 hours, she'd escalate. Now here's the thing. I could have just moved the camper, parked it around the corner or in my driveway. But it was the principle. This wasn't about rules. It was about control. Karen had made a career out of making people miserable with power she barely had. Last year she made Old Man Thompson repaint his fence 3 times because it was too beige. She fined a single mom for leaving her recycling bin out an extra day. And now, my camper was her new crusade. She thought I'd buckle. She thought I'd cave. Instead, I started making phone calls. I didn't even tell my wife at first because she already thinks I'm dramatic. But I drove down to the county office and asked one very specific question. Who owns the street? Turns out, not the HOA. It was part of a weird annexation deal from decades ago, and while the HOA had maintained it, the actual ownership still belonged to a defunct real estate developer who had gone bankrupt. The property was in legal limbo, part of a tax-defaulted portfolio being offloaded through a private trustee sale. It wasn't even expensive. I was stunned. For less than the price of a used Toyota Corolla, I could own the actual pavement Karen thought she ruled. I couldn't believe my luck. By Tuesday, I had a lawyer helping draft the paperwork. By Wednesday morning, my offer had been accepted. I wired the funds, signed the documents, and filed everything with the county. By the time Karen walked up with a smug grin and a new violation notice, I already held the deed. She slapped the notice on my camper's window and said, "Clock's ticking, neighbor." I looked her dead in the eyes and said, "You're right. Something big is about to happen." She rolled her eyes and strutted off, and I went inside to print out a copy of the recorded deed. That night, I sat in my camper and watched the neighborhood group chat explode. Karen had posted a long rant titled, "A Campaign to Clean Our Streets," filled with exclamation points, threats of legal action, and cherry-picked photos of my camper with dramatic captions like "blocking views" and "lowers property value." Comments were mixed. Some supported her. Others were fed up with her antic. One neighbor named Jenna posted a meme of Karen with devil horns and a quote that read, "Bow before the mighty clipboard." I liked it instantly. By Thursday morning, I was ready. I printed out 20 copies of the deed transfer, each clipped to a friendly letter titled, "Notice of Ownership Change, Street Easement and Parking Updates." I even included a little FAQ section at the bottom. Did it feel petty? Maybe. Did it feel amazing? Absolutely. I walked door to door handing out the letters. Most neighbors laughed. A few were confused. One guy offered to buy parking passes for his cousin's food truck. Then I made sure to leave one special copy folded neatly on Karen's porch with a ribbon and a sticky note that said, "Thought you should know." I returned home just in time to watch her open it from my living room window. She squinted at the paper, then her mouth fell open. She read it again. Then again. She looked around like the sky might fall. And then she screamed, an actual full-volume scream, and marched straight over to my house. I met her on the porch with a coffee in hand. She demanded to know what this nonsense was. I calmly explained that the street was no longer under HOA jurisdiction. As of 10:34 a.m. that morning, it was privately owned by my LLC. She accused me of fraud. I showed her the official county filing. She threatened to call the police. I encouraged her to go ahead. She stood there, visibly shaking, then stormed off muttering something about a lawsuit. But I wasn't done. I had a plan. Over the next few days, I'd roll out quiet but hilarious changes. Nothing illegal. Nothing outrageous. Just enough to make Karen's clipboard shudder with rage. But that was for later. Right now, all I wanted to do was sit back, sip my coffee, and enjoy the view of my perfectly legal, now untouchable camper. After all, they gave me 72 hours to move it. Turns out, I just needed 72 hours to buy the battlefield. Friday morning began with the sweet sound of silence. No HOA warnings taped to my door, no neighbor whisper campaigns, no Karen pacing in front of my camper like a guard dog defending sacred ground. Just birds chirping and the low hum of my coffee maker. I had slept better than I had in weeks, knowing that not only was my camper completely legal, but that every square inch of the pavement it rested on belonged to me. Still, I knew it wouldn't stay quiet for long. Karen wasn't the type to lick her wounds and retreat. She was a scorched earth kind of villain, and I had poked the bear with a burning stick. Sure enough, just before noon, I heard the rumble of a tow truck making its way down the block. I stepped outside just as the driver was slowing to a stop beside my camper. Karen stood proudly nearby, phone in hand, already recording. Her face was practically glowing with triumph. "You've exceeded your 72 hours, she announced to the world, and now this eyesore is being removed. The tow truck driver hopped out and gave me an apologetic shrug. "Sorry man, HOA called this in." I calmly pulled a copy of the street deed from my hoodie pocket and handed it to him. "This is private property now," I said. "And the camper is authorized by the property owner. Which is me." He read it once, looked at Karen, then looked back at me. "You serious?" he asked. "Dead serious. County recorded it yesterday." He let out a low whistle and handed the paper back. "Yeah, I'm not touching that. You all have fun." And with that, he climbed back into his truck and drove off. Karen was livid. She stormed up to me, pointing her finger like a prosecutor on a bad courtroom drama. "You don't get to just buy a street. That's not how the world works." I smiled and told her it absolutely was, provided you had the right legal structure and access to a little-known foreclosure list buried in the county archives. She sputtered, then pivoted to a new line of attack. "You're endangering the neighborhood. What if someone slips on your sidewalk? What if an ambulance can't get through?" I calmly reminded her that nothing about the street's layout or function had changed. Emergency vehicles could still access every house, and I had zero intention of blocking anyone's driveway or access. But the rules now came from me, not her. Later that day, I visited the city's planning department to finalize some paperwork for new signage. I wanted to make everything official, professional, and undeniably legal. The clerk there, a guy named Seth with a ponytail and a mug that read, "I drink and I know things," was surprisingly helpful. When I explained what happened, he couldn't stop laughing. He even asked if I'd consider doing a presentation on loopholes in property law for the local civics club. I told him I'd think about it. By the time I left the office, I had everything I needed to start rolling out Phase 2. Saturday morning, I installed the first sign. Private road entry by permission only, managed by Stone River Properties LLC. That was the name of my legal shell company, designed to sound like a corporate HOA's older, cooler cousin. Karen saw me hammering the post into the lawn strip and practically burst a vein. She came running out of her house in pajama pants and a fury only someone denied power can muster. "You can't just make up rules. That's what we do." I reminded her, politely but firmly, that she was no longer the governing body here. The street was mine, and I intended to manage it responsibly. She stomped back inside and slammed the door so hard her gnome statue tipped over. That afternoon, I distributed laminated flyers to each house on the block. The tone was warm and neighborly, not vindictive. I explained that while the HOA no longer had jurisdiction over our street, I planned to keep things running smoothly. I offered free parking permits to any resident who requested one and made it clear that the camper wasn't going anywhere. Most neighbors responded positively. One guy even brought me a six-pack and asked if I could help him figure out how to get out of some old HOA fees. Another offered to repaint my street lines in exchange for letting his teenage son host a block party next month. I said yes to both. But not everyone was happy. Sunday morning, I woke up to find spray paint scrawled across my camper. Red letters read, "Trailer trash," and "Go live in the woods." It was juvenile, sloppy, and spelled trash without the second S. I wasn't shocked. Karen had a history of stirring things up and letting others do the dirty work. I installed a small camera under the camper awning and spent the rest of the day repainting the graffiti with matte white sealant. It looked good as new by sunset. The footage from the camera? Not so subtle. It showed one of the HOA board members, a guy named Phil, sneaking out at 3:13 a.m. with a hoodie and a can of paint. I debated whether to report it, but instead, I decided to keep it in my back pocket for later. Monday arrived with a twist I hadn't expected. Karen had called for an emergency HOA meeting, and someone dropped a flyer in my mailbox that read, "Save our community from legal manipulation." I wasn't invited, of course, but I knew it would be a circus. That evening, I parked my camper directly across the street from the clubhouse where the meeting was being held. I pulled out a folding chair, a bag of popcorn, and watched as neighbors filed in with tired expressions. About halfway through, I got a text from Jenna, the meme girl. "Karen is losing it," she wrote. "She just said you're a corporate infiltrator, and called the deed a fake." I sent her a winking emoji and kept watching. An hour later, the doors burst open, and Karen stormed out with two other board members in tow. Her face was red, her hands clenched. I stood up, tipped my imaginary hat, and waved. She didn't even look at me. Just climbed into her golf cart and peeled off so fast it knocked over a recycling bin. The meeting had clearly not gone her way. Word on the street later was that several neighbors had demanded to see proof of her claims. When she couldn't produce any, the room turned on her. One guy reportedly stood up and asked if we were still paying dues for a road we didn't own. The silence that followed must have hit like a train. That night, as I sat in my camper drinking a cold beer, I reflected on how quickly power shifts when you remove the illusion of authority. Karen's control had always depended on fear and bluster. The second someone challenged her with facts, deeds, and polite confidence, the whole house of cards began to wobble. And now, the very road she once patrolled like a dictator was mine, freshly signed and soon to be freshly striped. But I wasn't done. Not by a long shot. Karen had one move left. I could feel it. Some desperate, last-ditch effort to regain her grip. And I was ready. I had backup plans. I had footage. I had neighbors on my side. But more than anything, I had something she couldn't understand. I didn't want control. I just wanted peace. And if she kept pushing, I was prepared to go from camper guy to full-blown neighborhood legend. Tuesday morning rolled in slow, but the energy on the block was anything but quiet. I knew something was up the moment I stepped outside and saw my neighbor, Mrs. Temple, clutching her morning paper and looking at me like I'd just declared martial law. A few houses down, the Hendersons were arguing on their front porch, and two teenage boys were zipping around on scooters yelling, "Camper King owns the street." I hadn't expected the nickname, but I guess when you buy a road and publicly outmaneuver the most power-hungry woman in the HOA, you earn a little local folklore. Still, I knew what was really fueling the tension that day: the letter I had dropped in every single mailbox the night before. It was short, respectful, and laced with very intentional information. I had titled it Ownership Notice and Neighborhood Improvements, and inside was a calm, well-structured summary of the legal shift in street ownership, a reminder that the HOA no longer had enforcement rights over parking or street usage, and a roadmap for minor upgrades I was planning. The cherry on top? A line that read, "To ensure a clean, safe, and cooperative neighborhood, Stone River Properties LLC will now oversee the management of this street under a resident-first policy." I didn't mention Karen by name, but the subtext might as well have been a laser pointer on her forehead. What I didn't expect, though, was Karen to respond before noon. Just as I was halfway through painting a fresh white line along the curb for designated visitor parking, she came charging down the sidewalk like a prosecutor on a warpath, waving a rolled-up paper and wearing oversized sunglasses like she was shielding herself from a scandal. She stopped 5 feet from me and said, loud enough for 2 passing joggers to hear, "This is illegal. It has to be. You can't just hijack our community with some sketchy paperwork." I didn't rise to it. I wiped my hands, reached for the folder I kept nearby, and opened it to the official deed copy, notarized and stamped, then offered her a copy of the flyer she clearly hadn't read thoroughly. "I didn't hijack anything," I said calmly. "I bought it. From the actual owners. And I'm trying to make it better." That phrase must have triggered something in her because she launched into a 5-minute rant about decorum, neighborhood tradition, and how allowing campers on a residential street would drive down property values and encourage lawlessness. She actually used the word lawlessness. I was about to suggest she watch fewer crime shows when a familiar voice interrupted. It was Mr. Galvez, one of the quietest neighbors on the block, standing at the edge of his driveway with a rake in hand. "Karen, he owns the road. Let it go," he said. Simple, firm, and absolute. She turned to him like he'd betrayed her. "You of all people should understand what's at stake," she barked. He just shrugged and said, "Honestly, I kind of like the guy. He's been more transparent than the board ever was." She turned back to me, mouth open, but words failing her for the first time since this entire circus began. I smiled. Then went back to painting the curb. Word spread fast after that. Jenna texted me a photo of the HOA group chat thread. Karen had posted a frantic message with bold caps and 5 exclamation marks about unauthorized rule changes and hostile takeovers. Someone replied with a laughing emoji. Then someone else posted a gif of Gandalf yelling, "You have no power here." It had over 40 reactions in 10 minutes. If the group chat was any indication, Karen's grip on the neighborhood was slipping faster than she realized. That evening, I received a knock at the door. It wasn't Karen. It was Phil, the same HOA board member my camera had caught defacing my camper 2 nights earlier. He looked sheepish, holding a 6-pack of beer and avoiding eye contact. I invited him in. He sat awkwardly at the kitchen island, fiddling with the beer tab, then finally said, "I didn't mean for things to get so personal." I let that hang for a second, then replied, "Phil, you spray-painted my camper." He looked up, guilt written all over his face. "Karen told us it was the only way to make you move. She said we'd all lose property value if we didn't stand together." I sighed. It wasn't the first time someone had blindly followed Karen's orders, and it probably wouldn't be the last. "I'm not going to press charges," I said. "But if you want to make things right, you can start by telling people the truth about what happened." He nodded slowly and promised he would. I believed him, mostly because he left the beer behind and muttered something about quitting the board. The next day brought something unexpected. A letter. Not an email or a text, but an actual stamped envelope slipped under my door. It was from Karen. The handwriting was tense and rigid, the message short and sour. It read, "We will not be intimidated. You may have tricked the system, but we are watching." I couldn't help but laugh. Who ends a letter with a threat that sounds like it came from a budget spy thriller? Still, I kept the letter. Something about the tone told me Karen wasn't finished. She was the type to escalate quietly, with city council complaints and code enforcement forms filed under aliases. To stay ahead, I called my lawyer and asked for a preemptive review of the ownership filing and usage right. He confirmed everything was airtight. The road had never been properly claimed by the HOA, and even if they tried to challenge it now, they'd face an uphill battle that would likely bankrupt their budget. That gave me the confidence to move forward with my next step. I ordered 2 custom street signs. One said, "Freedom Lane, privately owned by SRP LLC," and the second said, "No HOA enforcement beyond this point." When the delivery arrived, I spent the afternoon installing them with the help of 3 neighbors and a portable cement mixer. Karen's reaction came in the form of silence. No angry confrontation. No clipboard. Just silence. But that silence was loud in its own way. She was brewing something. I could feel it. Maybe a last-ditch attempt to reclaim control. Maybe a legal challenge. Or maybe she was just trying to figure out how to exist in a world where she wasn't the queen of the cul-de-sac. That night, I stood outside next to my camper, which now had a fresh coat of paint and a small banner that read, "Still parked. Still legal." Jenna and a few neighbors joined me for a casual chat. Someone brought cookies. Someone else brought folding chairs. It turned into an impromptu gathering, a celebration without labels. We talked about installing speed bumps, repainting crosswalks, even adding flower planters along the street. It was peaceful. Cooperative. What a neighborhood should feel like. As the sky darkened and the laughter faded, I looked down the road and saw Karen standing in her window, arms crossed, watching. She didn't yell. Didn't come outside. Just watched. And in that moment, I realized the battle was no longer about the camper. It was about power. And the thing about power is, it only works if people agree to give it to you. But once they see an alternative, someone who leads without demanding, who listens instead of orders, they start to rethink who they follow. I didn't need to win a war. I just needed to offer peace. The kind that comes with a folding chair, a cold drink, and a neighborhood that finally remembered how to smile. The first sign that Karen hadn't given up was subtle. It came in the form of an envelope taped to the street sign I had installed at the entrance of the block. I found it early one morning, fluttering slightly in the breeze, sealed with a bright red sticker that read, "Urgent Community Safety." Inside was a typed, single-spaced letter with Karen's signature at the bottom and a new HOA letterhead she must have designed overnight. The message accused me of endangering the community, questioned the legitimacy of my ownership, and claimed the HOA had voted to reassert authority over all shared neighborhood infrastructure, regardless of deed status. It sounded official, but it was just Karen's same old scare tactics dressed up in bureaucratic language. She had switched from clipboards to Microsoft Word. I could have ignored it, but I knew what she was doing. She was planting seeds of fear, hoping they'd grow in the minds of confused neighbors. If she couldn't win with threats, she'd try with confusion. So I decided it was time to clear things up once and for all. That weekend, I held an open gathering on what I now proudly referred to as Freedom Lane. I printed flyers and even offered refreshments. The message was simple. Come meet the new street owner, get your questions answered, and enjoy a free snow cone. Because nothing diffuses neighborhood tension like free sugar. On Saturday afternoon, folding tables lined the curb, neighbors trickled in with lawn chairs, and the air smelled like popcorn and waffle cones. I rented a snow cone machine from a party supply store and even had a Bluetooth speaker playing upbeat jazz. It looked more like a block party than a civic meeting, which was exactly the vibe I wanted. By 3 o'clock, over 30 people had gathered. I gave a brief talk, standing on an upside-down bucket with my deed in one hand and a snow cone in the other. I explained everything, from how I acquired the property legally to how my intentions weren't to control anyone, but to protect everyone from HOA overreach. The crowd listened, nodded, clapped a few times, and asked thoughtful questions. When one neighbor asked what would happen to HOA dues now that they didn't maintain the road, I told them they should demand a reduction or refund. That suggestion got the loudest applause of the day. Karen didn't attend the event, but she watched it. She stood on her porch the entire time, arms crossed, expression unreadable. At one point, I saw her take a photo with her phone and retreat inside. I figured she'd be back with a response soon, and I wasn't wrong. 2 days later, several neighbors received a packet in their mailboxes. Inside was a document Karen had clearly typed herself: petition to reclaim neighborhood streets under HOA oversight. She had even included a table of false claims, like alleging I had altered traffic patterns and restricted access to emergency vehicles, none of which had any basis in reality. It was so full of inaccuracies and paranoia that most people laughed it off. But it still worried me that she was pushing so hard, so recklessly, even after losing the legal ground. Then came her most dramatic move yet. She hired a contractor to repaint the street lines. I came home one afternoon to find 2 men in reflective vests and a line-marking machine halfway through repainting yellow boundaries over my white parking lines. I stopped my car in the middle of the road, got out, and asked who hired them. One of the guys said he was contracted by the neighborhood board. I told them the street was privately owned and that the paint job was unauthorized. When they didn't believe me, I showed them the deed and a cease and desist letter I had on standby. They paused, made a phone call, then packed up and left. Karen came storming out 10 minutes later, shouting about vandalism and abuse of power. I simply pointed to the fresh yellow line half removed and said, "You can't repaint what you don't own." That incident was the tipping point. Even Karen's few remaining allies started backing away. The elderly couple down the block, who used to wave politely at her, began waving more enthusiastically at me. Phil officially resigned from the HOA board and told the group chat he refused to be part of a circus. Jenna organized a neighborhood cleanup and invited me to help coordinate. More and more people started referring to the area as Freedom Lane, even those who had once sided with Karen. It wasn't just about a camper or a deed anymore. It was about trust, and hers was gone. Still, I knew the quiet after the storm is often just the eye. Karen was too committed to the illusion of authority to back down quietly. I started documenting everything, keeping a detailed log of every incident, every message, every flyer. My lawyer advised me to expect a legal notice next. And sure enough, a week later, I got one. A letter from a local law firm representing the HOA, claiming I had unlawfully disrupted neighborhood governance, and demanding I cease all activity on the street or face a civil suit. It was 10 pages long and full of legal buzzwords that sounded intimidating if you didn't know better. But I had done my homework. I sent the letter to my lawyer, who responded with a beautifully brutal 4-page rebuttal that cited case law, public record, and property code. Within 3 days, the firm quietly dropped the case and issued a retraction. That was when I decided to take things one step further. If the HOA was going to keep poking the bear, I would make sure they never got close to the honey again. I hired a local landscaping company to install decorative posts along the edge of the road with small signs that read, "Private road, community access welcome, no HOA enforcement." I added speed bumps to reduce joyriding teens, and for good measure, painted the curb in front of my camper with the words, "Reserved. Owner EST 2023. Then I had the whole area power washed and lined with flower pots filled with red and white petunias. It didn't just look better than before, it looked cared for, purposeful, lived in. The final blow came during the next HOA board meeting, where attendance was lower than ever. According to Jenna, who recorded part of it for Neighborhood Transparency, Karen tried to rally the remaining members for a full-blown lawsuit against me. But when pressed for evidence of wrongdoing, all she could offer was a stack of printed emails and screenshots of my camper. One by one, board members excused themselves. By the end of the meeting, Karen was sitting alone at the head of a table meant for 12, her voice echoing off empty walls. That night, I walked the length of the street. The air was cool, the stars were out, and everything was quiet. The camper sat peacefully under a string of solar-powered fairy lights. Kids' bikes leaned against fences. Porch lights glowed warm and steady. It didn't feel like a battleground anymore. It felt like home. And maybe that was the most satisfying revenge of all. Not the signs or the deed or even the way Karen had been forced to retreat into silence. It was the simple fact that a place once ruled by fear now thrived in laughter, respect, and peace. All because someone parked a camper, refused to be bullied, and chose to build a community instead of just defending one. The morning that Karen's final move arrived, I was halfway through sipping my coffee and scrolling through neighborhood group chat memes. Someone had edited her face onto the Wicked Witch of the West again, this time with the caption, "You have no jurisdiction here." I should have known that kind of public humiliation would be gasoline on whatever fuse she had left. The delivery came in the form of a certified letter slid under my front door. I recognized the law firm instantly. Same one from before, but this time the letter was bolder, more aggressive. Karen had filed a formal lawsuit in small claims court accusing me of community disruption, malicious property interference, and even mental distress. It was clear she had spent some serious time drafting this one or, more likely, bullying someone else into doing it for her. The accusations were ridiculous. She claimed I had intentionally distressed her with reckless disregard for the visual uniformity of the neighborhood. She wrote that I had targeted her emotionally by sponsoring neighborhood activities that excluded her and permanently altered the aesthetic harmony of the street. She even claimed the smell of waffle cones from my block gathering had triggered migraines and that the reflective speed bump posts had caused her dog anxiety. I almost choked on my coffee reading it. But despite how absurd it all sounded, I didn't laugh. Because Karen wasn't aiming to win, she was aiming to exhaust. She was betting I'd get tired, fed up, or worried. But what she didn't know was that the more she pushed, the more I dug in. I met with my attorney again that afternoon, handed him the letter, and waited for his face to twist in confusion. He flipped through the pages, muttered "desperate" twice, and asked if I wanted to counter. I shook my head. I had a better idea. Sometimes, when you're dealing with someone who thrives on conflict, the best revenge is a mirror. Let them implode on their own. All I needed to do was show up with facts and patience. Court was set for a Friday 2 weeks out. In the meantime, the neighborhood continued to shift. The tone changed. More people stopped to chat with me on evening walk. Even the couple who had quietly sided with Karen during the early drama showed up at my door one night with a bottle of wine and an apology. They'd realized too late that they were being used. Karen, meanwhile, had gone silent. No flyers, no rants, no sidewalk monologues. But behind the scenes, she was spiraling. I knew because Jenna kept me updated. Apparently, the remaining HOA board members had refused to back her lawsuit, and 3 had officially resigned. One even put his house up for sale, stating in his listing that he was tired of living in a battlefield. Yet Karen clung to the belief that she could still control something, and when she couldn't, she decided to drag the whole thing into court for one last showdown. On the day of the hearing, I wore jeans, a collared shirt, and brought every document I had: property records, HOA bylaws, photographs of all the positive changes, even community feedback from neighbors. Karen showed up in a full navy blue pantsuit, hair pin tight, and a binder so thick it looked like she was applying to become president of a country that didn't exist. She didn't look at me. She didn't speak. She just glared like I had personally destroyed her empire with a garden gnome. The judge, a tired-looking woman in her 50s, gave us each 10 minutes to present our case. Karen went first. Her voice was calm, rehearsed, and dripping with faux concern. She spoke about community values, about disruption, about stress and change, and the need for standard. She framed me as a lone saboteur who had hijacked a peaceful neighborhood. She even teared up slightly as she claimed that she no longer felt safe walking her dog down her own street. The judge nodded occasionally but never once interrupted. Then it was my turn. I stood, handed the clerk my folder of documents, and calmly walked the judge through the facts. I explained how the road had been in a legal gray zone, how I had followed every law to acquire ownership, how I had offered transparency to neighbors and even tried to collaborate. I submitted photos of the improved road conditions, of the flower planters and speed bump installations, of the neighborhood snow cone event that Karen herself had labeled an act of psychological warfare. I didn't mock her. I didn't argue. I just showed the truth. I ended with one simple line: all I've done is make a street better. The only thing I've threatened is control. When I finished, the courtroom was silent for a moment. Then the judge leaned forward and asked Karen one question. Can you produce any legal evidence that supports your right to manage or enforce policy on this particular road? Karen stammered. She mumbled something about assumed authority and long-standing practice. The judge nodded again, flipped through my documents, then looked at both of us and delivered her verdict. The lawsuit was dismissed. There was no legal standing for the HOA's claims, and Karen was ordered to pay court costs. She stood frozen. For a second I thought she might argue, but something in her broke. She picked up her giant binder, turned on her heel, and walked out of that courtroom without saying a word. I didn't follow. I didn't need to. The fight was over, and this time, it hadn't ended with a victory shout or neighborhood celebration. It ended with silence, the satisfying kind. Back on Freedom Lane, life finally returned to something resembling normal. The campers stayed, the road stayed, the neighbors stayed, but Karen didn't. 2 weeks after the court decision, her house went up for sale. The sign went up in the middle of the night, like she didn't want to give anyone the satisfaction of seeing her go. Her moving truck arrived one early morning, and by noon she was gone. No goodbye, no apology, just the sound of tires rolling over a road she no longer controlled. The day after she left, I hosted a barbecue. Nothing extravagant, just burgers, music, folding chairs, and laughter. A few people brought dishes. Someone set up cornhole. Jenna made a batch of cupcakes with tiny edible street signs on them that read "Freedom." At some point during the evening, someone clinked a glass and said, "To the man who bought the road." I raised my bottle, smiled, and replied, "To the neighborhood that made it worth buying." And that was the truth. I never did any of this for power or attention. I did it because people deserve to live without fear of pettiness, without being bullied over fences or paint colors or parked campers. Now, every time I walk out my front door, I see a street that feels alive. Kids ride their bikes without dodging potholes. Neighbors stop to chat instead of ducking behind hedges. The flower planters bloom like little reminders that peace doesn't come from rules. It comes from people who care enough to protect it. And as for me, I still park my camper right there on the curb, under the same tree, with a custom plate on the back that reads owner. Not because I need everyone to know I won, but because every time I look at it, I remember how far we've come. From a 3-day threat to a lifetime of freedom. All because one woman told me to move my camper, and I decided instead to move the ground she stood on.